Well, good morning. Here we are, snowing away, and hopefully you're at home safe. And I look forward to wanted to at least share a little bit with you today, and look forward to being able to be back together again. I felt that this was going to be a pretty easy call to make, and thankful that it was. I know I would have felt like a pretty big idiot if I woke up this morning and there was absolutely no snow on the ground, but every meteorologist in this whole country would have missed this one. So anyway, I want to look at I guess something the Lord has just kind of been speaking to my heart on here over the last several devotionals. I think that your own personal devotional life ought to be such that you're able to look at things that you're getting and saying, you know what, this is what the Lord's doing in my life, and this is where He's working here, and these are the things that I'm seeing. This is what I'm getting out of it. And I think sometimes we maybe don't put the right emphasis on this that we should. And so we take a look at this, and it's kind of I say a little bit of a random thing, but I want to deal with this question of faith or fear. Which one is it that characterizes you? I know that we, as believers, naturally desire to be men and women of faith. That certainly is a commendable thing. At the same time, I think we also recognize the struggle that we have to often trust God and to say, you know, this is out of my control, or this is, I can't see how this is going to work out, or whatever the case may be. And we struggle with this, and it's oftentimes a reality that we are battling. And so, there's been several passages here lately for me personally where the Lord has challenged me with this, and that's kind of what I want to focus on here this morning. Let's begin, and we're going to look in several passages, but Genesis chapter number 12 is the first passage. We had just been introduced to Abraham. His genealogy was given at the end of chapter number 11. The covenant is given in the beginning of chapter number 12 when Abraham is instructed to leave the land of Ur and to go to a land that he has promised him, and Abraham does so. He leaves his family. He takes Lot. A lot of debate on that. Not going to get into that. But he goes on and gets into this land, and all of a sudden a famine comes up. And it's Genesis chapter 12, verse number 10. The Bible tells us there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. So obviously, it was quite extensive, and this was not as though he just went one day without a meal. This was getting to be quite extensive. He could see the potential problems coming from this, and so he chose to go down to Egypt. And this was a very bad decision that's going to end up yielding some very bad consequences. It came to pass when he was come near to Egypt that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. Now, you're probably wondering on a lot of things, how in the world Abraham is able to pull this kind of thing off with Sarah, and I've wondered oftentimes the same thing. I cannot imagine trying to do this, but what is it that we see here with us? So I'm going to pull up a slide, and I think that's going to give us a little bit of a better picture of this. Whoops, wrong button. Hang on. That was not the one. Thing I want you to see is this. Fear views possible scenarios as though they are absolute certainties. I think that's exactly what we see here with Abraham. Fear views possible scenarios, but it does so as though they are absolute certainties. And when you read through this text in Genesis chapter number 12, there really is no doubt that what Abraham is thinking. Abraham is saying, okay, this is what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that they're going to look on you and they're going to see you are a beautiful woman, and they're going to say that this is Abraham's wife, and then they're going to kill me, and then they're going to keep you alive. So here's what we need to do. So you need to say to them that you're my sister, and then it will be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. There's definitely a lot of selfishness here in this entire plot, but What I want you to see is that he builds this entire case in his own mind on a presupposition or on an uncertainty, a possible scenario. But he views this as though this is something that is definitely going to occur. This is absolutely certain that this is what's going to happen. Now think about in your own life when you're battling fear. Isn't it typical that we end up taking the possible scenarios and we begin developing them in our own minds to the point that these possible scenarios become absolute certainties? And before long, what we find is that we are struggling with fear, and we're struggling with whether or not we are to make this kind of a decision, or what the nature of this decision is going to be like. And the reality is God's just simply asking us that we trust him, that we allow him to continue to work in our life, that we allow him to continue doing what it is that he is trying to do in our own lives. And so I challenge you in this here in this particular verse, or this section rather, to look at it and say, okay, Lord, what are the possible scenarios that I have turned into absolute scenarios? And I think we are living today in an age that is absolutely characterized by fear. Fear is prevalent. Fear, tragically, is being propagated. I think that people are making money off of making people fearful, and it's not right. Not to say that we do not exercise wisdom. It's not to say that we don't exercise some common sense, but we cannot sit here and reason among ourselves and say, well, this might happen. And now before long, this potential scenario becomes an absolute certainty in our own minds that's going to happen regardless of what you and I may be thinking, or some of the things that you and I may very well be struggling with. And so here for Abraham, they go down to Egypt. He should have never been there, but he did so. And he gets down there and he finds, here's going to be a problem. And the problem is they're going to say that you're my wife. They're going to say you're beautiful. They're going to kill me, and they're going to keep you alive. And so I need to get this into my own hands, and I need to take care of this. Fear is going to be such that is always going to view possible scenarios, and it is going to do so as though they are absolute certainties. I want us to move on into Genesis chapter 20 because I see a second thing, and that is this. Fear limits the power of God by focusing on improbabilities. I said Genesis 20, it'll actually be Genesis 18. Fear limits the power of God, and it does so by focusing on these improbabilities. Genesis chapter number 18 is the passage that I want to be at. And here's the text where Abraham is going to be sitting in his tent door, and the Lord is going to appear along with two other angels. Those two angels, according to chapter 19, are going to go on and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Meanwhile, the Lord is going to talk with Abraham at the end of Genesis 18, and this is the text where he prays, if there's 50 righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, would you spare it? And he gets all the way down to 10. I do find a great lesson there in the aspect of praying for Sodom and Gomorrah and the wickedness of the city. I think we are pretty judgmental, and I think we probably would have prayed more for their judgment. I think we need to be very careful that we maintain this kind of compassion. But anyway, before that conversation ever goes on, the Lord says that Sarah, and this is back in verse number 10, is going to have a son. Now, Sarah is at the tent door, and she hears this, and she laughs, according to verse number 12, and makes this statement, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also? In other words, this isn't going to happen. We're too old for this. There's no way that this is going to happen. In fact, verse 11 actually describes the situation, says they're old and they're well stricken in years, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. She was incapable of bearing children at this age. And so when God says, you're going to have a child, she laughs at that, and she says, well, this isn't going to be possible at all. And the Lord said unto Abraham, verse 13, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? The answer, of course, she says, well, no, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. Well, she did, and God knew that. But I want you to notice this question that is asked in verse number 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Well, the answer to that question is no. And now, that doesn't mean that we always just simply accept that answer and that we do really well with that. But the question is, anything too hard for the Lord? Let me just share something that I wrote down, and this was several days ago. But is anything too hard for the Lord? Well, the obvious answer is no. Then why do I worry? It's a great question. I never did come up with a very good answer for that. Here's another question I asked myself. Why do I not pray as though nothing is too hard? Well, the answer that I came up with was not a very good answer because it was very convicting. The answer is simple, a lack of faith. And I think that's exactly what we find. The reality is that there is nothing that is too hard for the Lord. And the reality is that oftentimes we find ourselves focusing on the improbabilities. And that is exactly what fear does. Fear puts an emphasis on the improbabilities. And it says, okay, this can't happen. And so therefore it's not going to happen. Sometimes we may look at our experience and we might say, well, you might have this, but my experience is that this is what's going to happen. And because this is what's going to happen, then I'm doomed. And this is where we end up oftentimes reasoning, and we put the emphasis on the wrong things. And exactly what Sarah is doing here is exactly that. She's saying, okay, here are these improbabilities, and this is what's going on, and I'm going to focus on those things. And God asks this question, is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, just because it's not too hard for the Lord, or just because God is capable of doing something, does not automatically mean that God is willing to do something. In this particular case, God has made a covenant with Abraham, and he has said, you're going to have a son, and you're going to have descendants, and you're going to be a father of many nations. And so obviously this has to take place, and that was God's will. So while we recognize in our own lives we may be praying for something, we cannot conclude that it certainly is possible for the Lord. We do conclude that, but we can't conclude that now therefore the Lord has to do this. Well, there is no limit as far as his ability. But we do sometimes question, well, what's the reality when it comes to this situation as far as his own will? It may very well be that it's not God's will that somebody be healed. It may be that it's not God's will that somebody be cured of cancer by a means other than by death. And so we may pray this way, and we may recognize, well, this is what God's capable of doing, and he is, but we also have to balance that with a recognition that says this is also God's will, and God's will has to be considered, and God's will has to be upheld and maintained. So when we focus, though, on fear, what we find is that we are focusing on the improbabilities of something. And so the result is that all of a sudden we start looking at all of the things and we say, okay, well, this can't be done because of this. And again, this is an area where admittedly, I'm going to struggle quite extensively. So we continue on, and this time we're going to go to Genesis 2. Not only does fear limit the power of God by focusing on probabilities, but we note thirdly, that decisions rooted in fear often are developed through many presuppositions that may not be true. I said Genesis 2, I meant Genesis 20. But anyway, decisions that are rooted in fear often are developed through many presuppositions that may or may not be true. So here's what I'm saying with all of this. I'm just going to leave this up in case you're trying to copy this down. You don't lose me too badly. Oftentimes, when we start building these scenarios, we go back to Genesis 12. That was exactly what's going on. He's building these scenarios in his own mind, and we start making decisions based on those things. That's exactly what he does in Genesis chapter 12, and it is exactly what he does here in Genesis chapter number 20. And so now we're into the exact same scenario, and it's funny because I say funny in the ironic sense, not funny in the ha-ha sense, but funny in the sense that he does not seem to pick up on this not being a good idea. And so here he is with Abimelech. He's in the region of Gerar, which is a Philistine city. Now, we know that the land has not yet come to Abraham, and so they're not occupying the land of Canaan right now. I mean, he's there, but it's not been given to Israel. So it's a Philistine city. And this is where he is. And Genesis 20, verse 2, Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Well, this is not a good idea. We did not learn from this previous situation in which he had already found himself. But I want to drop down in the conversation because eventually Abimelech finds out about this by means of a dream. And basically, God told him, if you touch her, you're going to be dead. And Abimelech calls Abraham and says, verse 9, what hast thou done unto us, and what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. Well, I'll tell you what, it's something when a pagan king rebukes a godly man. And that is exactly what we have here. Here is a pagan individual who still has a sense of morals, and he's like, this is not right. This should not have been done. But I want you to see in verse 10 this conversation. Abimelech said unto Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? What did you see? What did you perceive that would cause you to do this? And Abraham said, because I thought, surely, notice again the certainty of this. You could compare this with Genesis 12 and find a lot of the same principles. Surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Now, he goes on, he tries to explain, yes, it's kind of a half-lie because she's the daughter of my father, not the daughter of my mother. So in some ways this is true, in some ways it's not. Well, clearly what he said was intended to deceive, and so obviously he is guilty of telling a lie. But the question is, all right, what did you see that causes you to do this? And that takes me to this principle that decisions that are rooted in fear are often developed through lots of presuppositions. What was the presupposition in this text? According to this text, the presupposition was surely, absolute certainty, go back to slide number 1, surely the fear of God is not in this place. Now, that was a presupposition that, as it turns out, was actually not true, because when God appeared to Abimelech in a dream, he was terrified. And he said, look, if I touch her, I'm going to die, and you've brought all of this on. And and there were some other issues that are developed later on in Genesis 20. But my point is that here was a presupposition. Here's a thought that says, okay, there's no way God's being feared in this, so this is what we need to do. Again, it's the same principle that was made earlier on, but the point that I want to draw out here is this is now what happens to our decisions, and this is where we begin functioning, where we begin going wrong. And so here, if I'm being governed by fear, I'm going to focus on improbabilities. I'm going to view possible scenarios as though they are absolute certainties, and then I'm going to start making decisions. And the decisions that I'm making are not rooted in confidence in the Word and confidence in God, nor are they rooted in the Word of God themselves. Instead, these are decisions that are rooted in what I, quote unquote, know to be true. And the reality is, I don't know any of these things to be true. And it's all built on these presuppositions, and the reality is that it is damaging, and it is going to result in me making some very, very terrible decisions. And so here are 3 examples of individuals who are, in essence, going to be governed by fear. However, I also want us to look at another passage, and that passage is going to be in the Gospel of Mark. This is going to be found for us here in Mark chapter number 9, and it's going to be quite a scene that is going to be developed for us here, beginning in verse number let me just pick it up. Let's go to verse 15. We'll pick it up there. Straightway all the people, when they beheld him, this is Mark 9. Straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him, and saluted him. And he asked the scribes, what question ye with them? And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit, a demon that is incapable of speaking. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him. And he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth, or withereth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. And he answereth him, and saith, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. Now, I'm not going to get into all that's being said there. There's a lot there. I want to focus more on verse 20 and below. And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him. It seems as though physically tore him, tore open his body. He fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. Can you imagine being this father, seeing this happen to your child? And he goes on, because the situation is really quite bleak. And he asks his father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? In other words, how long has he been having this condition? And he said, of a child. Since he's been a child, this has been happening. And obviously it is something that has been happening repeatedly. Verse 22. Oft times, many times, it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. I cannot imagine being this father. Talk about being in an absolutely hopeless condition. There's nothing you can do to get this demonic spirit taken out of this individual. He's being thrown into fire. He's being cast into water, all to destroy him. God, would you please show compassion? Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. Now notice verse 24. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Let me move on in this and note a fourth principle. Not only is the decisions rooted in fear often developed through many presuppositions that may not be true, but finally, faith retains confidence in God's ability while remaining humble in one's inability. What is faith? Well, we could define it a lot of ways, but obviously the essence of faith is simply trusting God. So when I am exercising faith, I am retaining confidence in God's ability, and I am remaining at the same time humble in my own inability. You have probably said this phrase and maybe even repeated this phrase on a number of occasions, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Here was a father who was in a desperate situation, a situation that you and I would struggle even to be able to comprehend. And I'm sure that he has exhausted all of his resources trying to figure out how can we solve this? What can I do for this child? And he takes him to Jesus and he says, if you have any compassion, would you please heal him of this? And Jesus said, well, all things are possible to the one who believes. And he says, Lord, I believe, but I need you to help my unbelief. Well, I find myself here a lot. I find myself saying, Lord, I believe you're able to do this, but I'm struggling. Help my unbelief. And God does so. And I think that God, he doesn't rebuke him. You can imagine the joy that came over this father's heart as his son had this demon cast out of him and was finally able to live a normal life. But yet he doesn't rebuke this man for acknowledging his own lack of faith and his own struggle. I think about the time that you and I think we've got it whooped. God's going to shake it up. And God's going to remind us, you know what? You don't have it whooped. You begin to grow confident in your own abilities and your own abilities to solve things or your own decision making. And the reality is that we are not at all functioning with a level of humility that God would have us to function. And so it's a challenge for us. Do we look at faith or do we look at fear? Which one is it that characterizes me? Well, I'd love to sit here and say this morning that the only thing that I ever experience in my life is faith. My faith is just rock solid. Well, the reality is it's not. The reality is that I do allow fear into my own life. I do allow myself to focus on the improbabilities. I do allow myself to take possible scenarios and view them as though they are absolute certainties. I do find that the decisions that I have made in my own life or that I continue to make in my own life when I was fearful, that those kinds of decisions reflect the reality that I have built some sort of case up in my mind with lots of assumptions, lots of presuppositions that may or may not be true. But nonetheless, in my mind, I've built these things up. And the reality is that I have truly ended up creating quite a challenge. And it's unnecessary. I don't need to experience that, but yet it is the reality. And unfortunately, oftentimes that is exactly what ends up happening. So I hope this has been a help to you, a little bit of a challenge. I wanted to get on for a little bit of time this morning, not planning on doing anything else this afternoon or this evening. And so obviously, we're not having services today. I think that should go without say. But nonetheless, we'll look forward to being able to be back together, Lord willing, on Wednesday night. And you guys stay safe. And let me know if you need anything, if you run out of power or anything like that, and you need something. Don't hesitate to holler, right? God bless. Have a great day. Stay safe. Stay warm. Lord willing, I'll see you on Wednesday. Take care.